in the technical world, we've gotten much better at thinking in terms of customer value and what customers might want and asking them instead of saying, oh, yeah, we know how to solve this problem. I've been thinking of solutions for the past 10 days. And then, hoping that the customer was smart enough to appreciate what we've built.
Hi, I'm Andrew Davis.
And I'm Steve Pereira.
And this is the Value Stream Show.
Hi, folks. Welcome back to the Value Stream Show. I'm joined by my co-host, Andrew Davis. And today we will be talking about value streams and starting with what is a value stream? We definitely want to cover that early, considering it's this subject of our show. So let's get it out of the way, Andrew. What are we talking about when we're talking about what is a value stream?
So a value stream, to my knowledge, the term originates in Lean from the 80s and early 90s. So a value stream, one of our friends and colleagues described it the other day as a fancy term for a work process. And I used that description with Helen Beale, and she's looked shocked when I described it as that. Basically, it is a sequence of activities that results in producing value that is done with a repetition and a fluidity that it approaches a state of flow or a stream, so to speak. So it's a lateral process of the stages by which work gets done to deliver a valuable product or service. But there's this aspect of sequential processes, or primarily sequential processes, value delivery to a customer, and the smoothness of the flow that over time and with optimization approaches a flow or a stream state. That's I'm sure you can do a more succinct version.
No, I think that does a good job. I think one of the things that I like to talk about when talking about value streams is that they already exist inside of organizations. We're just talking about a logical model for thinking about and talking about and analyzing the flow of work across the organization. And, folks can call them business processes. They can call them mechanisms. They can call them anything that they want. I find it valuable to talk about value streams because a couple of things are first-class citizens in that term. And I think that including specific words in terminology is valuable for sort of setting a frame. And I like the frame of value streams because value is there. And I've been bitten many times by doing things without considering value and having value absent the party. And then the stream aspect, this aspect of flow, right? That things should be continuous and repeatable and somewhat uniform and ideally, predictable to a degree so that we can focus on novelty and creativity and take the rest for granted. So I've always found that, the term value stream, it didn't initially resonate with me. The first time I learned the term value stream, I was in business school and I didn't really have a practical application for it. And I saw a value stream map and that didn't seem interesting or valuable to me in my context because I worked in the digital world. And value stream and value stream management and value streams come out of this sort of physical world. It wasn't until later that I realized that all of that theory and methodology and definition can be sort of ported into the digital world and help us because we're kind of missing models that refer to a lot of these things we're trying to do: deliver value, achieve flow, understand how to measure work, and improve it. And I see value streams as a concept, bringing us something that allows us to talk about those things, reason about them, share a lexicon to have high quality discussions about what's actually happening and what's going to really make a difference.
I love that framing and the focus on the terminology. And just to draw the contrast out a little bit more strongly, if you take my original term that I threw out, work process, work is a cost. Just by definition, it's not speaking about value. You incur the cost of work, whether anything valuable comes of it or not. And so it really does reverse your perspective from thinking in terms of, okay, I've got to show up and do work, and the business has to incur the cost of its daily operations, and that's what we do. We all show up and do work. totally moving away from that view of what's happening to the idea that what's the job to be done. And I know like the lean enterprise group says, what's the problem that you're solving? That's the first thing you start with. Like, that's the first question you have to answer. What problem does your business exist to solve? Why do you exist? What is the value that you create? And then keeping that framing, I'd mentioned, this emerging out of the lean movement. I've pulled up in front of me again from the Lean Enterprise Institute, these 5 stages of lean that came out of this book, Lean Thinking by James Womack and Daniel Jones. The idea that the first thing you need to do is discern what is the value that you're creating, or precisely specify value by product. So every product or every team needs to identify clearly the value that they're delivering. And then you map the value stream and you basically figure out what does it take to produce that value. And so that's thinking backwards. I know it's a theme that you love to dwell on, starting with what's the end result for the customer, for example, and then you work backwards. And what are the stages that actually have to be done? That's mapping the value stream. And then lean proceeds from there to establishing flow, which is moving in that direction of trying to create that continuity, the smoothness, the steadiness, reducing waste and handoffs and so forth. And that's where things begin to approximate a stream. And you'd said that these 2 words, value and stream, both resonate, right? So value resonates as opposed to cost, for example, and it focuses on the customer. And stream also resonates as opposed to discontinuities and emergencies and the final 2 steps in lean, just for completeness, my obsessive compulsive tendencies in my brain. So establishing pull instead of trying to push things through. Pull, which again speaks to the customer's point of view, and making sure that your cadence is set by them, and then continuously pursuing perfection. And I think all of these resonate a lot with what we're doing. So.
No, that was really valuable, because I think that what I was going to mention was that tech and IT and software, sort of the digital aspect of business, has been now promoted to a seat at the conference table, right? And for a very long time, in a lot of my career, tech was this kind of second-class citizen, siloed off into its own kind of department. And the approach was very much push-based. There was this giant backlog of things that needed to be done. The emphasis was like, just do the things, get them done. And what was missing was that pull and that definition of value. And now we're in a point where there's an appreciation for what technology can bring to business, and it really being essential to success. And so now there is a possibility to have pull, because people are sort of connecting the dots between what technology can do, what we want to get from technology. And technology is getting much better at marketing itself, so that the business and customers are educated in what they want. And sort of, we're much more able to think in terms of, ask for whatever you'd like, pull that, and we'll figure out how to deliver it, right? Make that request for what's valuable to you. And in the technical world, we've gotten much better at thinking in terms of customer value and what customers might want, and asking them, instead of saying, oh yeah, we know how to solve this problem. I've been thinking of solutions for the past 10 days and just building stuff, and then, hoping that the customer was smart enough to appreciate what we've built. We are now in a position where it's much more likely that you are asking customers what they'd like, and being a little bit more humble about trying to serve the needs of a customer versus assuming that you have something valuable for them and that they just need to appreciate it. And so that, value streams give us this mechanism to sort of talk about work in that model of pulling, working backwards, and facilitating customer needs with technology, rather than building things and hoping that people appreciate your efforts.
And so, our decision to name this show the Value Stream Show indicates a degree of commitment we've committed ourselves to. Saying that this one analogy will be able to yield or tie into a huge range of other topics, because a lot has to happen. Any metaphor is imperfect, of course, but there's a lot in this metaphor of a value stream that you've got to think about and understand clearly to be effective in your organization. So the value stream speaks to the entire end-to-end process. So for example, if there's not a pull from the customer side, if there's not a demand for the product that you're creating, there's not a stream, right? There's some damming up of that, or the whatever work you're doing is basically being drained away. So the stream implies a kind of steadiness over time, where there's definitely a downstream demand on which represented by the customer. And then there's an upstream source, all of the various efforts and contributions of the people contributing to the efforts. There's a variety of failure modes that you could incur. And Steve mentioned one of them, which is, the IT team builds stuff because it's the right thing to do, but you didn't necessarily think about, was there going to be a customer? And I think that may, whether that failure mode is likely to arise or not depends on your situation. But for a lot of technical startup founders, that's probably the case. They've got a brilliant idea. They want to build it. They didn't think about sales or marketing until closer to the end. So that's one example where the supply of capabilities gets ahead of the demand. But there's other important aspects to this where, for example, every team that I've ever been on, our backlog was way bigger than we could possibly accomplish. So there was no, because I was on internal IT teams, and typically IT is the slowdown for these things. It's not shortage of demand for the service of IT, it's shortage of ability to actually get things done, which of course, another failure mode, you've just got this endless backlog. And so one of the key points that's made in the lean movement, and that we're increasingly trying to borrow that wisdom and import it into the IT world, is the idea of limiting the amount of work in progress and keeping the small number of things in progress at any given time, so that you can actually deliver on each one more quickly. And for example, the idea with the value stream is you figure out how much time does it technically take at minimum to complete one process, and begin to measure how long is it actually taking you to get your work done versus the theoretical shortest time. And you begin to see this massive difference, right? This massive difference between the lead time, the time it's actually taking you, versus the cycle time, the theoretical shortest time it might take you. And you realize that that's because you're trying to do more than one thing at a time. You've got a lot of irons in the fire at the same time. And so everything's just slowly trickling through, and you realize you don't have much of a stream at all. So we've been talking about enabling development teams to have greater impact on their business. So I want to pause briefly to talk about the next generation of development teams, and to thank our sponsor, Copado. Copado's focus is on bringing the power of DevOps to low-code platforms such as Salesforce, ServiceNow, and SAP. The world of development is changing fast, and a lot of the IT innovation happening in our organizations now is being done on these low-code platforms, and being done by people who may not have a traditional software development background. So the challenge is that these systems are becoming incredibly complex. So low-code development may be easy to begin with and easier to get started with, but when you're dealing with dozens or even hundreds of contributors working over the course of months and years, you pretty quickly reach a scale where you need things like version control, automated deployments, automated testing, and value stream management. So that's where Copado helps as the leading DevOps and testing platform for low-code. So if you're managing a platform like Salesforce, ServiceNow, or SAP, check them out at copado.com, get a demo, and find tons of other resources. Now back to our show.
Yeah, and there's other aspects that we don't often consider until we're kind of walking the stream, right? And trying to understand what's really happening, which is one of the main hallmarks, I think, of a value stream model versus a business process model, because a business process is typically modeled out as a future state, something or some idealized representation of what should happen. And so it's missing a lot of things, right? And in reality, what happens is, I tried to do this thing and I realized that I need access to this other system. So I had to go ask the IT team to give me access to this thing. And that meant I had to fill out a request. And then they have a 6-day SLA, and the SLA is not actually enforced, and somebody was on vacation. And so, like, when you think about the actual flow versus the design of that workflow, you start to see this, as you mentioned, massive difference between reality and design. And of course, improving a design that doesn't reflect reality doesn't actually give us any benefit. But if we understand what's really happening and we kind of design for that, we design to make reality a little bit better in measurable ways with a focus on something that we can point at and have a good conversation about, our odds of success go way up, right? Instead of hoping that something happens when we kind of design an idealized flow that's we're never going to reach, because reality is much more complicated.
And that goes back to your original point that value streams already exist within the organization. They just may not be given that name or recognized or identified. And this idea of focusing on trying to understand, speaking to you and I talk a lot about clarity, trying to get clarity about what's actually happening in an organization. Value streams, obviously speaking to this water analogy, but just the way that water finds a way, it's always going to find the easiest, quickest path downhill, right? And natural systems have a way of making themselves work one way or another. And that's where we get this deviation between what's the theoretical approach that people are taking versus what's the actual approach. What actually goes into delivering a product, making a new feature available, something like that. Something I know we'll get into in later episodes, but the idea that this is not a process that is constrained to one part of the org chart, not necessarily constrained to one department or one team. That's the other thing that is important to call out about value stream. It is cross-departmental. It is from customer request to customer delivery. It covers all the steps in between. Like an electric circuit, you have to make sure that it's actually conductive. Look at the entire length of that path. What are all the touch points between customer request and customer delivery? What are all the pieces that have to be accomplished? And that, I think, again, just like the theoretical, traditional idea of devising a business process and rolling that out to the company, it's important in the sense of it allows you to take a strategic approach to how you want to work, but it may be constrained by a lot of our assumptions. It's similar to the formal design of an organizational chart or an organizational structure. It's constrained by how we logically think the company should operate. Whereas the reality is that there are lots of interrelationships between different departments and pieces of work that are not necessarily constrained by the org chart or the formal business processes.
Yeah, that's a good point of illustration, I think, for drawing, a mental image of a value stream. Just this idea of, if we want, a lot of organizations right now are trying to grapple with this idea of value streams and asking the question, how do we find our value streams, right? We get that they're in the organization. How do we actually find them? And a lot of organizations are trying to sort of create value streams, like intentionally design value streams, which I think is an admirable pursuit. But first, you sort of have to understand, as we said, like the current state, what's actually happening right now, to avoid that kind of like design first and struggle with the reconciliation of reality to your design. So thinking back from an example, let's say, we have people always use loan application as an example because it's pretty well known to folks. We're always asking people for money, I guess. So loan application, let's say we're building a piece of software that allows people to get a quote for a loan. And in order to do that, if we were working forwards, we'd have to sort of like come up with, okay, well, what happens first? And first could be many, many steps upstream. We could be talking about an entire portfolio full of products and what happens when we eventually start working on our loan application software. But if we work backwards, we could sort of just step through the things that happen and sort of talk about, okay, well, someone is applying for a loan. What happened before that happened? And it was the feature of loan application was like turned on. So we say, the software was kind of activated. And for that to happen, it has to be deployed into production. And for that to happen, it has to be sort of set into a ready state, which means that it had to kind of check some quality criteria. And maybe there was some user acceptance testing before that. And for that to happen, we had to have a closed pull request because the code had to be kind of merged into some main line. And for that to happen, we had to have a code review. And for that to happen, we had to have some development effort. Maybe we open a pull request before that happens. And before that, we might have had a design review and an architectural review. And then we would have had sort of product prioritization or a product definition stage. And before that, we're sort of taking something off of the backlog, some idea off of the backlog that's been prioritized. And then maybe we're actually representing the prioritization mechanism. So how we decided to do that thing. But we could sort of draw those boundaries, right? And we could say, well, we don't want to go too far. We don't want this stream to cover everything that we could possibly look at just for the purposes of clarity, right? And you do get diminishing returns, and it can get really messy if you go too far. If you try to make a stream that covers all the way from the very origins of an idea, but there is a boundary that's kind of valuable, right? So that we don't miss something when we're having a conversation. Because if we represent a value stream and it's too narrow, let's say we're only talking about code to production, for instance. Someone commits a line of code and it gets deployed out into production. We might be missing a couple of important areas, right? We might be missing planning and shaping and design, which could take a lot of time, be very complicated. There could be a lot of waste there to be found. Likewise, if we're only measuring up to deployment, things might just sit around for weeks before a customer actually uses it because it never gets turned on. So kind of drawing the boundaries wide enough is one of the efforts in defining value streams and trying to understand what it looks like so that you can start to measure and optimize it.
And it's funny when you started talking about the analogy of a loan application, I was thinking you were going to say this is the stages through which the loan application itself goes. My stepdad was a loan officer in banks for a while. Like the point of view from somebody who's actually working in a bank, setting that up is that's a value stream itself. Here, we're talking mostly about value streams in IT, where we're building the underlying systems that enable that. As you can see, they're interrelated between each other, but the stages that Steve's mentioning, and planning, building, testing, pull requests, all these kinds of things, these are familiar to us as the development lifecycle, or familiar, these days people are, the word DevOps getting applied to everything, so value stream management value stream speaks to, in the software development process, it speaks primarily to that software development lifecycle, but then going beyond to upstream levels, downstream levels, to make sure you can make the connection to the customer, and perhaps also looking at some of these tangential elements that have to flow in. Like Steve says, we don't want to bring in everything. Technically, everything is connected to everything else. Like even mapping a stream, you have to set an arbitrary boundary because you can't, theoretically the water has come from rain and all this stuff. But you set a theoretical boundary to make it possible to understand, and then use that to figure out how to optimize that process. and help people to think about it more effectively?
One of the things that folks might benefit from is this, what you mentioned about DevOps kind of encompassing everything now, and DevOps being so overloaded. And that I think is part of why value streams are gaining popularity, right? We kind of hit this breaking point with DevOps where folks were like, well, it's really DevSecOps, and it's really biz DevSecOps, and it's really biz design DevSecOps, CX, and then success. And where does it stop, right? And so we could either take something like DevOps and kind of bolt all these other things onto it that matter and should be considered, or we could use a concept like value stream that naturally incorporates all these aspects. And that's kind of what served as a light bulb moment for me in shifting my attention from DevOps to value streams. Was I was seeing people use a model for work that didn't fit the scope that I thought was valuable and where I was seeing constraints and challenges, right? I think we've largely solved a lot of the challenges and unknowns in DevOps, between Dev and Ops, right? The flow between Dev and Ops. We've developed lots of capability, lots of knowledge in that space. And so naturally the constraint has moved, right? I mean, this is one of the fundamental lean concepts that value stream is based on, is the idea that you always have a constraint. It's somewhere in the value stream, and you have to kind of discover it and measure it, or measure it to discover it. And once you solve for that constraint, there's another one. And solving for constraints is really how you get this flow. And so when I was thinking about DevOps and value streams and looking at real teams, in real teams, they would struggle with things like planning and shaping and design and architectural reviews or change advisory boards. And those are outside the boundaries of DevOps. They obviously have impact, right? Because they're upstream, or, in some cases they're downstream. And so we just needed something that kind of naturally fit the requirements of what we were tackling. And that brought me to value streams. And I think that might be what's bringing folks to the podcast. And I would love to hear from folks about whether or not, that's something that they've noticed or something that they're interested in learning more about, and that's why they're here.
So let us know what we can help clarify, or questions you have, or suggestions, or anything you'd like to hear us talk about, or anything we've missed. We'd love to hear from you. That's it for this episode, but look forward to exploring different aspects of this in future sessions. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Please rate, review, and share the podcast, and make sure to visit us at valuestreamshow.com to sign up for our newsletter and find show notes, episodes, and more.